All right, welcome to Underground Catholicism. I am your host today, Elijah Yassi, and as you all know here, you guys are here for a specific reason here. We are doing a show to rebuttal or refute or what have you, Ubi Petrus on Papal Infallibility, specifically a video he did on Papal Infallibility in the Tome of Leo, where he went after Catholic apologists, especially Eric Ibarra, who is, as you guys know, a good friend of mine. And so today, let me go ahead and try to fix this. And by the way, I am running off of almost no sleep, so excuse me here. I'm really exhausted, so if I look tired, my apologies. Now, this is not going to be an attack on Ubi Petrus or an attack on anyone. I'm going to be dealing with strictly the content of Ubi Petrus, and nothing else. That's what I'm here for. I'm not here to attack Eastern Orthodoxy. I'm just here to look at the content, and that's pretty much it. So who is Ubi Petrus? As I mentioned earlier, we're doing a refutation of him. He is an Eastern Orthodox, and I call him a polemical apologist. And I don't want to make that sound like it's derogatory or anything. What that means is that when he does apologetics, he only emphasizes things that are going to help his case. He doesn't have a balanced view. It's almost like Catholicism has nowhere to stand and has nothing, and Eastern Orthodoxy has everything that it stands on solid ground, and Catholicism has nothing to stand on. And they don't have a balanced view. Where I would admit that Eastern Orthodoxy has a good point against Roman Catholicism, whereas Ubi Petrus, I've never seen him admit such a point to where anything that you bring up from history, even though it seems to support the Roman Catholic Church, he would dismiss it and try to explain it away somehow. And so that's what I mean by polemical apologist. He uses a fake name, Ubi Petrus. We don't know who he is. We don't know his real name. He has a blog and a YouTube page where he tries to refute the Catholic Church. And like I mentioned earlier, the video that we're going to be dealing with is his video on Papal Infallibility. And just a little bit of an announcement. And by the way, can you guys see the slide clearly or not? I don't know if you guys can read it. If you guys can let me know in the comment section if you're able to see it, I'd really appreciate that. Clearly or not, I don't know if you guys can read it. If you guys can let me know for someone to respond here, because sometimes I'd really appreciate that. That's probably because of my internet clear. All right, thanks, William. I appreciate William and Eric for being here. If you guys can let me know for someone to respond here, because sometimes I'd really appreciate that. That's probably because of my internet clear. All right, thanks, William. I appreciate William and Eric into this. If you guys can let me know for someone to respond here, because sometimes the Immaculate Conception and original sin. So to appreciate William and Eric into this, if you guys can let me know for refutation here. This is going to be video 1 of, I don't know how long. I mean, just today I probably have enough hours, so I'll probably a refutation here. This is probably video breaking part 1 into different parts. I mean, just today I probably have how far I can get. I don't know how far I'm going to get. This isn't for the faint of heart. We're going to be doing a lot of reading, a lot of resources, references. I'm talking. This isn't for the faint of heart. But we're going to be doing. I don't have any credentials, so anytime I have an opinion, I would have to go back to this isn't for the Catholic theologians. I don't have Catholic bishops, Catholic popes. So anytime scholars have an opinion, I would have to go back to this isn't for the Catholic theologians. I don't have. Let me see if I can fix that here. Scholars have an opinion. This isn't for the Catholic theologians. I don't have. How is that? Is that better? Can you guys hear me now without an echo? Okay, I guess it's still not fixed. Okay, perfect. So I just had to take out the, I had the YouTube open. Perfect. Okay, sounds good. All right, so going back to what I was saying. So I'm putting a pause on the Immaculate Conception series. I'm going to get back to it in the future, but I think this is a much more needed topic. We didn't hear any of your words. Last 40 seconds. Okay, well, I was going to repeat it real quick. So I'm putting a pause on the Immaculate Conception series, and I'm going to come back to it later. I'm going to be doing these refutations, and this is going to take me hours and hours and hours because there's so many resources here. I have Catholic theologians, Catholic scholars, popes, bishops, councils. I'm quoting everything. I'm putting it all out there, and in fact, there's so much more that I can quote that I didn't have time to put in. But this is going to be a multiple part series. This is part one, and part one itself will probably have multiple parts in and of itself. I don't know how much, because we're going to be doing a lot of reading, a lot of pages of books from theologians, Catholic theologians. And the thing is, I don't have any credentials. I don't have a degree in theology or anything like that. I'm just a dude here. I echo again. I don't know why that's happening. Let me try something. Is that better? A lot of problems today. My bad. I muted myself. So I've been doing Catholic apologetics, just privately studying it for 15 years. And one of the topics that I've really had an obsession about is the Vatican I and the Relatio of Bishop Gasser. We're going to get into that. We're going to get into that topic, and we're going to get into the Relatio, and we're going to read the Relatio in context, pages and pages and pages of it. We're not just going to be taking snippets, right? And that's what Ubi does, and he takes it out of context. Are you going to be debating Medway? And you guys will see something here. I'm not interested in debating Eastern Orthodoxy on papal infallibility, and you'll see why. Because we don't agree on what the Catholic Church even teaches on it. They'll say, you guys teach this, and I'll say, well, no, we don't teach this. This is what we really teach. So in order for me to debate somebody on a topic, we would first have to agree what the topic is, right? Because we don't even agree on the actual topic. They would say something like, well, the Pope can just act alone as a lone ranger, and I would contend that, and I'll qualify that, right? Because there's truth to that, but I will qualify that, and you guys will see as the show goes on, you'll see why I'm not interested in debating in Eastern Orthodoxy on papal infallibility. You'll see why, but I am interested in debating in Eastern Orthodox on Immaculate Conception. I think that one for me would be more fun. And maybe one day an Eastern Orthodox person can watch this and say, hey, you know what? I agree with what you're saying here. I agree with what you believe the Catholic Church actually teaches. And I'm going to, from that, debate you on that. I'm okay with that. I'll do that. But I'm not going to debate an Eastern Orthodoxy who doesn't even understand papal infallibility in the first place, right? So this is this slide here. So what this is and what this isn't. This is not a refutation of Eastern Orthodoxy. I know I'm going to be made into memes and all that stuff, and what they do with reason and theology folks like Eric, Michael, and William, especially Eric and Michael. I don't think you want to mess with William. That guy is huge. But this is not a refutation of Eastern Orthodoxy. Okay, I'm not refuting. I'm not going against Eastern Orthodoxy here. In fact, I think this is a more so almost ecumenical, because I'm going to be sharing a balanced view of what papal infallibility actually is. Where they try to represent it as one side, I'm going to balance it out. And you'll see that what they believe about papal infallibility is not what it actually is. This is not an attempt to convert Eastern Orthodox Christians to the Catholic Church. That's not my job here. That's not what I'm here for. This is not for Eastern Orthodox folks. If you're Eastern Orthodox out there and you're watching, welcome to the show. I appreciate you being here, but don't take this personal. This is a defense of the Catholic teaching on papal infallibility, and strictly for Catholics, to help them see the truth of papal infallibility and not be tempted to be deceived by Ubi's tactics, right? And when I say tactics, and he's a polemical apologist, he'll show you one side, and I'm going to balance that out. Again, I'm not here to attack Ubi. In fact, I encourage everyone to pray for Ubi, and pray for everyone out there that struggles with this topic as Catholics, because that's my ministry. That's what I'm focused on. I'm focused on helping Catholics remain in the church rather than focus on bringing Eastern Orthodox to the Catholic Church, right? And so where I'm coming from, I'm speaking to Catholics. And so a lot of things that I'm going to be saying, if you're Eastern Orthodoxy or Oriental Orthodox or Protestant or whatever, you're going to be like, that's not convincing to me. Well, it's not supposed to be convincing to you. It's supposed to be convincing to those who are Catholic, who I believe have that sensus of faith, sensus fidelium. So I already have a question here. How do we even prove papal supremacy in the first 4 centuries? I'm glad you asked that, because I just want to point out that this is not a show on papal supremacy. This is the show on papal infallibility, and that's a big difference. I'm probably going to be doing a series on papal supremacy in the future, months down the line, but this is papal infallibility, right? That's what this is, not supremacy. So I'm not going to be answering that question because it has nothing to do with the topic at hand. So the points to keep in mind while we go through the show is at Vatican I, what a lot of people don't realize is that there were actually 3 groups. I have minority and majority party, but the groups on the majority side were actually split as well, right? And there was a majority that had a minority within it, and a majority that had a majority within it. And then there was the minority on the opposite side of the debate. And so basically, just to sum it up, there are 3 stances on papal infallibility at the time of the council. There was what was called the maximalist interpretation or maximalist stance on papal infallibility, which means the Pope has sovereign power. He has all the power in the world. He can do whatever he wants. If he farts, it's infallible. Whatever he does, it's infallible. And these guys were interested in the centralization of Rome for the purpose of unity, right? Because they're worried about, for example, what happened with the French Revolution. They're worried about what happened with the Protestant Reformation, and they want to centralize the faith in order to have one person, the Pope, telling everyone what to do, and so that way there's unity. That way there's unity there. So this is a stance that was utterly and absolutely rejected by Vatican I. Okay, this is rejected by Vatican I, and the thing is a lot of people think that was what Vatican I actually taught, and there's a reason for that. The reason is because those people, those bishops at Vatican I that were the extremists, the maximalists, they what they did is they acted as if the Vatican I Council is speaking their stance. They're like, "Hey, we won," and they're telling the media, they're telling the world that our stance won out. And they were the best at the public relations. They were the best at marketing their stance out there as if that's the official stance of the church. And that's why today we have the problem of the Pope doing an interview in an airplane, and he says something and everyone goes berserk, right? It's because that effect of Vatican I, of those those bishops that made it seem like that's what the Catholic Church actually taught, that's what won out. That's what is the effect of that today. Those are the consequences. And at Vatican II and on, we've had this sort of a tipping scale, a balancing out of what Vatican I taught. Not a change in teaching. And remember, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, but Vatican I was an incomplete council. It was an incomplete council. The first session, the first thing that they wanted to define is papal infallibility and papal supremacy. But after that, they were going to define the authority and the power and the teaching authority, especially of the bishops, the body of bishops united with the head. They were going to, they were going to go into that. However, there was a war that cut it short, and they had to stop the council at that time. And so that's why it looks so imbalanced. It looks like, they're just trying to give the Pope as much power as possible. When on the contrary, they're actually trying to limit the Pope's power as much as possible in terms of papal infallibility. And we'll see that here as we read the Vatican I Council. And actually, and you guys will see here, I'm going to be playing the video from Ubi Petrus. I'm going to be playing different snippets and going through it little by little. Hopefully there's not going to be an echo, but I'll figure it out, hopefully. So that's the majority party. That was the extremist party. Now, within the majority party, there was the more moderate view of papal infallibility. Moderate view meaning, the Pope is limited in his infallibility. He can't just, proclaim infallibility on anything he wants. It has to be faith and morals. It has to be addressed to the church. He has to speak from the chair. Things like that. And so that's the version that won out. However, the minority wanted to include in the documents, in the actual decree of papal infallibility, that the Pope has to first seek the manifest consent of the bishops before he acts. That's what they wanted, right? And so we'll see what happened with that, and you'll see the discussion here as we read the Relatio, and how Bishop Gasser, who was the one that was tasked by the Pope to put together the official interpretation of papal infallibility, to where the popes read that and vote on papal infallibility. So they're reading that document that we're about to read, and they're going to say, okay, I agree or I disagree with this. And so this is the official interpretation of papal infallibility of Pastor Eternus, which is specifically chapter 4 of Pastor Eternus, which gets into papal infallibility. So, and then we'll talk about Gallicanism here. Gallicanism was this movement in the Catholic Church a few hundred years ago, and it's pretty much died down, or pretty much not there anymore, where the Pope had to first seek permission from the bishops before he did anything. Before he acted, he had to get permission from the bishops. And that's something that you'll probably see within Eastern Orthodoxy or Oriental Orthodoxy. That's kind of like where it falls under, but not perfectly, right? Because Gallicanism, a lot of it was a political movement where the kings wanted the local bishop to have as much power as possible, and to take away the power from the Pope, so that the king who can tell the local bishops whatever he wants, and the bishop would do it, and so ultimately the power goes to the king. And so that's the whole purpose of Gallicanism on the political side. And so the Catholic Church and Vatican I is refuting Gallicanism, right? So keep that in mind. That's very important. We're refuting Gallicanism here. So hopefully this is going to work, right? Because I have these videos that I want to play. Like, he's going to go through the definition of papal infallibility. So I'm going to mute myself, and I'm going to try to play this, and you all let me know if this is working or not. So let's see how this works. Sorry, I was muted. It's not working here, so I have to click on it from the PowerPoint itself. So let's go back here. PowerPoint slide. And we're here, and we're going to do this.
According to the First Vatican Council, quote, therefore, faithfully adhering to the tradition received from the beginning of the Christian religion, for the glory of God our Savior, for the exaltation.
Now, before I do this, did you guys hear any of that? I just played a few seconds just to test it. Were you guys able to hear it? I'm just waiting to see a response here. I know Unum Sanctum said yes, but I'm not sure if he's saying okay. Sweet. Okay, the video isn't that important. If you can't see the video, it's okay. But let me see if I can make the video visible. Let me put the StreamYard somewhere else. And now that looks bad. Let me move it back here. Okay, so, and this is where I need Michael Lofton. He's really good at this stuff. Let's see. So let's go back to, okay. Let me rewind it a little bit.
Faithfully adhering to the tradition received.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and play it.
From the beginning of the Christian religion, for the glory of God our Savior, for the exaltation of www.ubipetrus.ecclesia.com for those who would prefer to read it. According to the First Vatican Council, quote, therefore, faithfully adhering to the tradition received from the beginning of the Christian religion, for the glory of God our Savior, for the exaltation of the Catholic faith and the salvation of the Christian people, with the approval of the Sacred Council, we teach and define that it is a divinely revealed dogma that the Roman Pontiff, when he speaks ex cathedra, in other words, when exercising his office as pastor and teacher of all Christians, he defines by his supreme apostolic authority a doctrine of faith or morals which must be held by the universal church, enjoys, through the divine assistance, that infallibility promised to him in Blessed Peter, and with which the divine Redeemer wanted his church to be endowed in defining doctrine of faith or morals, and therefore, that the definitions of the same Roman Pontiff are irreformable of themselves, and not from the consent of the church. If anyone should presume to contradict this definition of ours, may God prevent that happening. Anathema sit. End quote.
Okay. You guys heard that, right? I'm assuming you guys heard it. So he's just giving the definition of papal infallibility. So I'm gonna be allowing Ubi Petrus to do a lot of my work here, because the very beginning of the video, it's actually a nice introduction into papal infallibility, and it's a nice introduction into the importance of the Relatio of Bishop Gasser, how important it is. He did my dirty work there for me. Oh, excuse me. And so the thing that he highlighted here, and this is the most, in my opinion, the most misunderstood sentence in the history of ecumenical councils in the Catholic Church. Okay, this is the most misunderstood one, and therefore that the definitions of the same Roman Pontiff are irreformable of themselves and not from the consent of the church. And this is what people are getting out of this, like Ubi Petrus. And you'll see that. What they're getting out of this is that the Pope can speak ex cathedra without having the consent of the church behind him, and he'll be infallible, and everyone just has to bow down to him and say amen and kiss his feet, right? Again, there is truth to that, not the kissing his feet or bowing down to him, but there's truth to that, but it's not the full truth. It's missing a lot of context. And once you put that in context, you'll be like, whoa, I didn't realize papal infallibility wasn't that bad, right? I thought it was something else, and I'm speaking as the way you're going to be thinking as I go through this. And you'll see that it's a very, 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 very balanced teaching. It's a very balanced teaching. Okay. And so I'm gonna continue playing this here real quick.
Vatican I's dogmatic constitution, Pastor Aeternus, stating that the Roman Catholic Pope can, at his pleasure, bind the Church to dogmatic decrees without the consent of the worldwide episcopate. But the Pope, we are told by Catholic apologists.
So did you hear that? The Pope can bind the Church. The Pope can bind the Church without the consent of the episcopate. That's what he says, right? Is that really what Vatican I taught? Was that really the mind of the Vatican I fathers? That's the mind of Ubi Petrus. That's the mind of, Eastern Orthodox fellows out there. That's the mind of some Protestants. That's the mind of some Oriental Orthodox. But that doesn't matter. What matters is what was the mind of the Council Fathers at Vatican I? What was the mind? What do they have in mind? As far as this question of seeking out the consent of the church, does he have the obligation to or not? We'll get into that. We're going to talk about that. So, and he's going to go through, some apologists here and what they believe. So we're going to go ahead and play that real quick.
Could not do this on a whim, and that if he did decree something against the deposit of faith, the faithful are not obliged to obey it, and the bishops could depose him, or so they claim.
Now, did you catch that? I don't know where he's getting. He doesn't source what he's saying. What he's saying is there are some Catholic apologists out there who say that, if the Pope decrees something ex cathedra and that thing is heresy, we don't have to follow it. What Catholic apologist in their right mind believes that? He doesn't give. He just shows 8 apologists here, misrepresents them by putting their picture up there. You can go ask each and every single one of them. They'll be like, if the Pope decrees something ex cathedra, it's infallible, end of story. You can't go against it. That's it. That's what we believe. And he's misrepresenting these Catholic apologists, which is unfortunate. But let's go ahead and continue.
Of course, this then begs the question of what, quote, not from the consent of the Church, end quote, means if one can simply ignore pronouncements from the Pope when he intends to bind. It also begs the question of what exactly is the point of a Pope who can speak infallibly and without the consent of the Church, if even a layman can out-interpret the Pope in matters of faith and morals.
A layman can out-interpret the Pope. What is he talking about? I don't understand this, because we believe that when the Pope decrees something ex cathedra, that's it. No layman, no bishop, no priest, nobody. Doesn't matter how many people you have that are against it. You can't say anything. That's it. That's it's decreed. It's done, and you'll see why. And you're not going to have a huge number of body of bishops being against it. That just goes against what we believe, and you'll see. And again, I'm speaking to Catholics. This is divine providence. This is a grace that God gives the church, where he leads the head and the body to the truth. He's not just leading the Pope. Listen very carefully. I'm going to say this, and I'm going to emphasize this because it's a very important point. The Catholic Church does not believe that there will ever be a time where the Pope is the only infallible bishop in the church. That would falsify the church. The church as a whole is infallible, not just the Pope. And the church extends that infallibility to the Pope. And the Pope speaks the mind of the church when he decrees. He speaks the mind of the church, and we're going to get into that and unpack that. We're going to unpack that little by little here. And so, we don't believe that there's ever going to be a time where the body and the head are going to sever. They're going to split. There's always going to be bishops that are in communion with the Pope that are going to be orthodox with him, because the church is infallible, not just the Pope. Okay, he's the only one who's protected from error when he officially decrees something infallible, and we're going to get into that as well. That's a very important point to keep in mind.
A traditionalist might say, well, it's easy. Simply look at previous magisterial documents. But this is the same logic as sola scriptura, and simply rebounds back to the second question. What then is the point of having an infallible pope who can speak without the consent of the church if even a layman can out-interpret him? But we are in luck, because at the First Vatican Council, in order to make sure no such confusion could or would take place, one bishop was specifically tasked by Pope Pius IX to produce a document clarifying exactly what is meant by pastor aeternus. And this work was then ratified by the Council in toto as the official interpretation of Vatican I's fourth chapter of Pastor Aeternus.
And what he's saying here is true. And that's the part that I like about this video of his, is he's building this foundation that the document of the Relatio of Bishop Gasser is the official interpretation of papal infallibility. So if you want to know what papal infallibility teaches, Vatican I teaches on that topic, chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus, you go read that document. I've obsessed about this document for like 10 to 15 years. You can ask my wife. I'm like the biggest weirdo when it comes to this topic. Embarrassing story. When my wife and I were engaged, I told her, I'm excited. One day when we're married, I'd love to sit down and read this Relatio with you. And she's like, it was a miracle that, she was able to marry me after that. I'm just giving you this idea that I've read that document, the Relatio, probably more times than I've watched The Office, which is probably hundreds of times per episode. Just trying to tell you guys that this is something that I've obsessed about. I've read books on, and so I'm not coming from a place of I just watched this video and then now I'm trying to refute it, right? I'm not. That's not what I'm doing. That's not what I'm doing. This is a topic that I've been wanting to do videos on, probably in the last year or two. And this is a perfect opportunity to do this with Ubi Petrus's video to rebuttal what he's saying. So let's go ahead and continue on. And he's going to build a very nice case for how important this Relatio is.
This work, commonly known as Bishop Gasser's Relatio, is formally known among the council documents as the official Relatio on Infallibility of Bishop Vincent Gasser at Vatican Council I. For the purposes of this video, we are using the translation and commentary by Father James T. O'Connor, published by the Daughters of St. Paul in 1986, and possessing both a nihil obstat and imprimatur, and thereby has been approved as a document containing no heresy. This was the first translation of the Relatio made, and it bears the name, the Gift of Infallibility. In his translation and commentary to it, Father O'Connor makes clear the importance of the Relatio, stating, quote, "Central to all the discussions on the meaning of papal infallibility, as Vatican I defined it, has been the official presentation, the Relatio, made by Bishop Vincent Ferrer Gasser to the General Congregation of Bishops of Vatican I, which took place on July the 11th, 1870, end quote. Father O'Connor follows this by saying, quote, "So important is the Relatio of Gasser that it has itself become a theological source, cited in innumerable manuals and theological treatments, and serving even in our own times as a key element in the renewed theological discussions about infallibility. Indeed, the Second Vatican Council, in its dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, cites Gasser's Relatio 4 times in its important chapter on the magisterium or teaching office of Pope and bishops. Paragraph number 25 has approximately only 55 lines of text and 8 official footnotes. Thus, half of the citations in that key section of Vatican II's Lumen Gentium are to Gasser's Relatio. End quote.
Okay, so basically, he's building the foundation of the importance of it, and then he's going to get into the contents of it, out of context, right? He's going to take it out of context, and we're going to put those quotes that he takes out of context back in their proper context, and then we're going to show that our interpretation of the Relatio is in line with no other than Pope Pius IX, who was the Pope at the time of the Vatican I Council. So if there's anyone that would know what the council taught on papal infallibility, it would be him. And also bishops that were at the council, we have their sayings and what they believed. And so if anyone would know, it's them, not Ubi Petrus, not Elijah Yassi, not the reason in theology, folks. You know, what we're going to be discussing here is going to come from the mind of the folks that were at the council themselves. What did they have in mind? And so, and I just want to real quick mention this. The first parts of these videos are going to be explaining what the Catholic Church teaches on papal infallibility, specifically that sentence that the Pope's decrees are irreformable in and of themselves and not from the consent of the Church. That line, we're going to be spending hours unpacking. What does that line mean? Looking at history, looking at what they had in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and continue on, and he's going to get into the contents of it. But before I do, and then the second half of what I'll be doing in these videos is I'm going to go into the first millennium after I show what Vatican I taught on papal infallibility and what Vatican II taught and what the Catholic Church teaches. Then we can go into first millennium and say, based on what we believe, here is the evidence for papal infallibility. Here they are. Excuse me, my phone's ringing. The evidence has to be based on the real version of papal infallibility, not the one that Ubi has in mind, because Ubi wants evidence of the Pope from the first millennium where he stands up, puffs his chest, and says, "Everyone listen here. This is how it's going to be," and everyone says, "Amen." That's what he thinks papal infallibility is. Nothing could be further from the truth. That would actually be contrary to what papal infallibility is, right? And we're gonna get into that and unpack that, what it is and how we can prove it or how we can have evidence for it. But let's go ahead and continue on with the video. And by the way, I'm not going to be playing his whole video throughout, just in case you're wondering. I think there's probably like 8 to 10 minutes of it that I will be playing. And once I'm done with that, then we're going to go and look into the contents of the Relatio in context, because he's about to take it out of context, right here. So.
And bishops. Paragraph number 25 has approximately only 55 lines of text and 8 official footnotes. Thus, half of the citations in that key section of Vatican II's Lumen Gentium are to Gasser's Relatio. End quote. He then goes on to state, quote, "The deputation then entrusted to Gasser the task of relaying its recommendations and of giving an official explanation of the meaning of the amended draft, so that the bishops would know precisely what they were voting on when they came to approve or reject the proposed Chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus. It is in this aspect of his task that the importance of Gasser's Relatio can be discerned. It is the key to proper interpretation of Chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus, as it was finally approved since the bishops voted on it, as explained by Gasser representing the Deputation de Fide. End quote. With this in mind, it is worth now delving into what Chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus means when it states, quote, the definitions of the same Roman pontiff are irreformable of themselves and not from the consent of the Church, end quote.
So here we go. He's going to get into that section, and he's going to interpret what he believes Gasser is saying on that the Pope does not need the consent of the Church. He's going to get into that. And by the way, I sped up the as you guys saw it to 1.25 just because this is taking too long here. So I'd like to go ahead and get his video out of the way and before we dive into it. So let's go ahead and play it again.
The Relatio is clear on this, stating, quote, finally, we do not separate the Pope, even minimally, from the consent of the Church, as long as that consent is not laid down as a condition which is either antecedent or consequent, end quote. And further, quote, if these words of Christ are to have their necessary force, then it seems to me that one should conclude that the brothers, that is, the bishops, in order that they may be firm in the faith, need the aid and advice of Peter and his successors, and not vice versa, end quote. To put it more directly, the bishops rely on the infallibility and opinions of the Pope, not the Pope on the universal episcopate. Such a centralized act, such putting all one's eggs in a single basket, is how the Catholic Church has ended up in the situation it is now. Criticizing the view of the conciliarists and Gallicans, which states the Pope must have the consent of the bishops in order to issue dogmatic decrees, Gasser's Relatio states, quote, as such, this type of necessity cannot have a place in the definition of a dogmatic constitution.
Okay, so this is key, what he quotes from the Relatio here. As such, this type of necessity, and when he says necessity, what is he talking about? In the Relatio, it's talking about the necessity of the Pope to seek out the consent from the episcopate, from the bishops. Gasser is saying we cannot place that condition into the actual definition itself. But is he denying that the Pope has an obligation to seek that consent? So that you have to be a careful thinker, and you have to understand distinctions between types of thoughts. This is a very nuanced topic, and Ubi Petrus approaches it without thinking carefully, without having understood the proper context of what Gasser is saying. And what we're doing is we're putting it back into the context of the historical context and the context of its actual content. And so that's our task, that's our duty today. And again, we're doing this for Catholics. So if you're Eastern Orthodox, enjoy this show. But I'm not here to convince you of papal infallibility. But if you are convinced, then praise God. Distinction of reason, reasoned. And I'm reading y'all's comments here and there as I'm doing the show. Anyway, let's go ahead and see if there's any more content that he plays here on his video that he reads.
End quote. He even differentiates how papal infallibility works differently from other modes of teaching that would require the assent of the episcopate. Quote, it is true that the consent of the present preaching of the whole magisterium of the Church, united with its head, is a rule of faith even for the Church, is a rule of faith even for pontifical definitions. But from all that, it can in no way be deduced that there is a strict and absolute necessity of seeking that consent from the rulers of the Church or from the bishops. End quote. The Pope may, if he chooses, receive advice from others, but again, he is not obliged to, and the idea that he might be obliged to is seen as so dangerous that it simply cannot be inserted into the dogmatic decree. Quote, it can happen that there be so difficult a case that the Pope think it necessary, for his own information, to ask the bishops, as an ordinary means, what the sense of the churches is, as he did, for example, in the case of the Immaculate Conception. Such a case, however, is not able to be established as a rule. End quote. So strong is this sentiment against the belief that the Pope must gain the consent of his brother bishops before binding the universal Church in matters of faith or morals, that the Relatio states, quote, "Therefore, whoever contends that the Pope, either for his information or for an infallible judgment about faith and morals, totally depends on the manifest consent of the bishops or on their aid, has nothing left to do than to establish that false."
I want you guys to pay attention, and Nama Palsu sounds like he has a great understanding of the Relatio, because he emphasizes what I was about to emphasize later on, this word manifest consent and totally depends. If anyone contends that the Pope, either for his information or for an infallible judgment about faith and morals, totally depends on the manifest consent. What does manifest consent mean? Manifest consent means that the Pope has to physically and literally actually poll the bishops and ask their belief and permission and agreement and all that stuff before he decrees. Manifest consent. It's not denying that the Pope is required to have a consent of the church. He does need consent. He does not need manifest consent. And I will qualify that. And I will unpack what that means as we go through this. And I can't believe it's been almost an hour already. I'm going to try to limit this to 2 hours. And then I'll do part 2 possibly tonight. If not tonight, I'll post a little video. If you subscribe, you'll see the notification of when I'll be doing the second one, third, fourth, and all the other ones. But I think I might be able to do part 2 of part 1 tonight, if possible. But I need to end this by about 3 o'clock in this first part. And there's no way we're going to get through all of this in another hour. Absolutely not. But let me go ahead and have him read this. And this is what I like. He's doing all my dirty work for me. He's setting it all up, and then we're going to place it back in context.
False principle which says that all dogmatic judgments of the Roman pontiff are weak and reformable in and of themselves, unless the consent of the church accrues to them. But such an outlook is either completely arbitrary or subversive of all papal infallibility. End quote. Father O'Connor, whose translation and commentary we are using, steps in to make this even clearer by commenting on the 1682 Declaration of the French Clergy, stating, quote, "Declaration, following in tone some of the conciliarist decrees of the Council of Constance, especially the Sacrosancta of April 1415, held in its 4th article, to be cited by Gasser later in his Relatio, that the Pope has the chief role when it comes to matters of faith, but that nonetheless, his decisions needed confirmation by the judgment of the entire Church. This position is, in essence, the thesis of Gallicanism, which, in one form or another, perdured into the 19th century, and which was ever in the background, and sometimes in the foreground, of the discussions on primacy and papal infallibility at Vatican Council I." End quote. Gallicanism, for those not aware, was at one time as much as 1/3 of the Catholic faithful as it was the official position of the French Church in both France and all its provinces. Its position was analogous to the Orthodox Christian position that the Pope's role was as head of the Synod, and not an infallible autocrat at his own will as the Catholic Church currently holds. But don't these categories apply only to those instances in which the Pope speaks ex cathedra? Not so.
Okay, this is where we're going to stop the video and we're going to start unpacking things. This is where the fun starts. And I just wanted to lay down this foundation from Ubi Petrus in his video here. I just wanted to lay it down so you guys have an understanding of what we're dealing with here. And I already went through all these from current slide. So you guys have an understanding of what we're dealing with. Basically, his thesis is that Vatican I taught officially, and in the interpretation of Vatican I and Pastor Returnus, that the Pope does not need to seek the consent of the Church before he defines. And when he defines, if it's in opposition to the rest of the Church, everyone has to just bow down to him. Now that's an impossible situation from the Catholic perspective. Ubi Petrus is coming from this idea, from the perspective that papal infallibility is false. It's basically from Satan, right? It's a demonic. He doesn't call it that, But to him, it's a false dogma, and it needs correction, right? And so he's arguing from that perspective. That's very important to keep in mind, because now I'm talking to Catholics. We believe papal infallibility was a gift given to the church by Christ himself in Matthew 16, right? And so it's not the Pope that we're putting our faith in, it's Christ's promise that we're putting our faith in, right? And I'm not here today going to back up that claim yet. That's going to be in a future show, to show that our interpretation of Matthew 16 is the patristic understanding. And I'm not just saying that, where the church is built on Peter alone and all that stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about, in terms of papal infallibility, the fathers used Matthew 16, John 20, Luke 22, with all those famous papal quotes, to show that the Pope, when he teaches as a public figure, not as a private person, he's infallible, right? When there's a question of faith basically arises, when there's disputes in the church, then the Pope stands up and says, "This is the truth." He's infallible. I'll be backing that up with evidence in a future show on a different part on papal infallibility. But today we want to refute Ubi Petrus on the actual teaching of what papal infallibility is, rather than what he has in mind, because he's not being a careful thinker when he's doing this, right? So let's get into it, right? Let's get into it. So, and this is, and I have the Kindle edition. I'm going to actually get into the contents of it. We're going to be reading the Relatio in pages, right? Like I said earlier, if you guys heard me, I don't know if I was echoing at the time. This is not for the faint of heart. This is not a show today or in all these series for those who want the cut and dry version of things. I am going to be going deep into this topic. Okay, so this is it's going to get very complicated, and I'm going to ask and plead for your patience with me, because it's going to be a lot of things that we're going to be going into and reading. So first, I want to just read the section before I get into the actual Relatio. What he says is, finally, we do not separate the Pope, even minimally, from the consent of the church, as long as that consent is not laid down as a condition that is either antecedent or consequent. This is the Relatio of Gasser. What he means by antecedent is a condition that that is before, like before he declares ex cathedra, that we're not going to lay it down as a condition for the Pope to seek the consent of the church or of the bishop, right? And consequent is, after the fact. That means when the Pope declares, he doesn't need to go pull the bishops beforehand, and the bishops don't need to confirm it after the fact. Again, he's saying we're not laying this down as a condition. Okay? We're not laying this, and this is important. Keep that in mind. We are not able to separate the Pope from the consent of the church, because this consent is never able to be lacking to him. There's never going to come a time where the Pope is going to decree something that's going to be in complete opposition to the rest of the church. That's an absurd impossibility for us Catholics, because we believe that just as Christ leads the Pope into, or not leads the Pope, and I'm going to get into that and unpack that. But just as Christ prevents the Pope from speaking error when he's declaring ex cathedra, he will make sure that both head and body are in unison together when the decree is made. Okay? And this is a good time to stop and talk about something real quick. What papal infallibility is and what it isn't. Listen very carefully. This is very important, because this is going to be the crux of what I'm going to be proving here. papal infallibility does not come in the form of inspiration. The Pope is not going to be inspired like the Gospels or the Word of God. He's not inspired in that sense. He's not inspired in any sense. And the Relatio is going to get into that, and we'll look into it in context. The Pope has a divine assistance, different than inspiration, that prevents him from speaking error. Okay, that prevents him from speaking error. That's a very important distinction to make, because there are people out there who ask this question. If the Catholic Church has defined papal infallibility, then why do we need ecumenical councils? Why can't we just go to the Pope and he'll answer all the questions for us? As if he has this pipeline to heaven, like as he has Christ's phone number on speed dial. Beep. Hey, Lord God, hey, they're asking me this question, and I just want to ask you what the answer is. What do you think it is? And so I can tell everyone. That's not how it works. That's not how it works, right? The way it works is the Pope is not led into the truth of a teaching. He's not led into it in the sense of that's not where the gift is. So when there's a question of dispute among the bishops that arises in the church, it's not like just because there's a question, there's going to be this thing that triggers inside the Pope's mind that goes, oh, he has the answer to it. It's not how it works. When the Pope is about to decree something that is, let's just take an example. If the Pope is about to decree something that is heretical, he will be somehow impeded by divine providence of making that declaration, meaning he'll be that God will not allow him to make that declaration. It's not like God is going to change the Pope's mind as he's about to declare something heretical. God steps in and goes, boom, and he like smashes his brain and corrects it right at that moment. And then all of a sudden the Pope is saying things that he didn't realize he was about to say. That's not how it works. That's how Ubi Petrus wants you to think it works. Okay? And so the important part here is the Pope, the reason why this seeking of the consent of the church is important, because if the Pope doesn't know what the consent of the church is, and by consent here, I mean teaching of the church. Because remember, papal infallibility has to do with the deposit of faith, what has been put in the deposit, and things that are directly related to it, to that deposit of faith. Okay? So the Trinity, that comes from God himself. That's a teaching of Christ and the apostles and the fathers, right? So that's an apostolic teaching. And so the Pope, if he's going to declare something, he can't contradict what the teaching of the Trinity is. He'll never be able to. He'll be impeded from making that contradiction. The gift has to do with God stopping the Pope from declaring heresy. It doesn't have to do with God leading the Pope into that truth. Okay, it's important. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't lead the Pope into the truth, but that's not what papal infallibility is. That's divine providence. We believe that eventually, if it is the will of God for the Pope to declare whatever it is he's about to declare, and it's orthodox, that God will make sure that the Pope has full information to know that this dogma that he's about to declare has the backing of the church's consent, from present consent all the way back to the apostles. That means it's always been taught in some form, shape, form, or whatever. You guys know what I'm talking. Again, lack of sleep. Sorry. So that's very important, right? And so now we answer the question: if papal infallibility is defined, then why do you need ecumenical councils? Because it's no different for papal infallibility. The Pope still needs to seek what the church believes, and he does this by looking at Scripture, by looking at tradition, by looking at the church fathers, and by looking at and by asking the bishops or theologians, hey, homies, what does the church believe in terms of this thing that is in question, or this thing that you guys want me to declare as infallible, or this thing that I want to declare as infallible? What does the church believe? He has the moral obligation of seeking out the consent before he declares it. Now you're gonna say, wait a minute, doesn't Vatican I say he doesn't need the consent of the church? Well, that's what this show is about. We're disproving that interpretation, that part where it says he doesn't need the consent of the church has nothing to do with the Pope not needing the consent of the church before he decrees. It has to do with, pay very close attention, it has to do with the fact that when the Pope decrees something, when he decrees it, and that means once it comes out as an official stance, it is now infallible. What makes it infallible, and this is what Vatican I is saying when he takes it out of context, when it says not the consent of the church, his stance are irreformable in and of themselves and not from the consent of the church. What that means is that his stance, his decree, the ex cathedra, is infallible, not because the consent of the church is behind it, even though that's a condition that must be there. The consent of the church must be behind it in some way, shape, or form. Not, and when I say consent, I mean agreement. And when I mean agreement, I don't mean like the whole body of bishops all 100% say yes. It could be like, a fraction of the bishops, but it has to be part of the bishops that their consent is behind it. And so Vatican I is not saying that consent is not important or not necessary. It's saying that consent is not what makes it infallible. What makes it infallible is the promise of Christ to Peter in Matthew 16. That's what makes it infallible. That's what that's the gift of papal infallibility. He is prevented from speaking in error. And so when he speaks, then we know it's not an error because the gift prevents him from speaking in error. And that is what makes it infallible. And they're saying, Vatican I is saying, it has nothing to do with the consent of the church in terms of what makes it infallible. What makes it infallible is God himself. That's what it's saying. And that's why when it says it is irreformable in and of itself, it's talking about the actual decree, not the Roman pontiff himself. The actual decree is irreformable and not from the consent of the church. Okay, so I unpacked a lot there, but I'm going to get into that. Father Rev. James O'Connor is the person that, as Obi mentioned, translated the work of the Relatio, and he has his commentary on it. And he comments, and he says, in a sense, says Gasser, papal infallibility may be called separate. And we're going to get into that, what that means from the Relatio, since it is given by a special promise of Christ, produced by a special aid of the Holy Spirit, and given to one who serves a unique role in the church. As such, it is not identical with the gift of indefectibility and infallibility, in truth promised to the entire church. Having said all that, however, Gasser is insistent in pointing out all the ways that papal infallibility is not separate, insofar as it is not apart from or opposed to or set over against the entire church. The Pope can teach infallibly because he receives the gift of inerrancy as chief teacher of the church when he is defining a truth of faith or morals for the entire church. Furthermore, pay very close attention to this. This is the commentary of the person who translated the work, right? He says, furthermore, the cooperation and assent of the church is always an aspect of papal infallibility. The Pope is morally bound. Morally bound. He's obligated morally, not juridically. It's not a rule, but morally he is bound to use all appropriate means for ascertaining revealed truth, among which is the seeking of prudent advice from whatever source necessary. This moral necessity for seeking counsel comes in part from the fact that infallibility does not work by way of divine inspiration, we just talked about. This remark of Gasser means, to put it in rather crude terminology, often used in polemics, that the Pope has no pipeline to heaven, what we just talked about. It is rather a divine assistance that guarantees that after consultation, study, prayer, he will never make a mistake when he definitively proposes a truth to be believed by the entire church, or definitively rejects an error as something that must not be held by the church. The consent of the church will always be present. The consent of the church will always be present to such teaching, since it is the same Spirit who gives the gift of infallibility for the sake of the truth, and sees to it that the church welcomes such truth. That means that what he's about to decree will always have the consent of the church behind it. But the consent of the church behind it is not what makes it infallible. It's not what makes it infallible. That's all Vatican I was saying. And it was saying that to defeat the heresy of Gallicanism. And we're going to quote theologians, scholars, Pope Pius's interpretation, bishops, Pope John Paul II, Vatican II, and we're going to show what Vatican I really meant versus what Ubi Petrus thinks it meant, right? Huge, huge difference. Okay. And like I said, I'm just giving the full story because he doesn't give the full story. So moving on to the next one, he says, and this is from the Relatio now. Indeed, since we believe that the Pope is infallible through the divine assistance, by that very fact, we also believe that the assent of the church will not be lacking to his definitions, since it is not able to happen that the body of bishops be separated from its head, and since the Church Universal is not able to fail. What Ubi Petrus wants us to do as Catholics is to go into history and show him a case where the Pope acted alone without the bishops and everyone bowed down to him. Where does papal infallibility teach that is actually prudent or not sinful? It is actually sinful. It is actually sinful for the Pope to decree something without first seeking the mind of the church. And it wouldn't be good on his part to do that, because if he's not sure that the church believes this thing that he's about to decree, if he's not sure, God will impede him. And one way God can impede somebody is by, striking them dead or changing their mind or allowing the bishops to talk to the Pope and change his mind. We don't know how. Somehow he'll impede it. We don't know how. But we know that he cannot decree something that is in opposition to the consent of the church, because his job is not to make up new doctrines. His job is to make known the things that have always been taught by the church. And so if they've always been taught, then consent has to be behind them. If they're not behind his teachings, then that means they were never taught. They were never taught. And so that would be a false dogma, and he will be impeded from making it. So as long as he is able to make it, now we know a few things. If he makes it, it has behind it the consent of the church. It has behind it the stamp of God. And it has behind it the tradition of the church, that it has always taught this. Very important distinctions. And if you're not a careful thinker, you're going to miss this, and you're going to think, hey, Pope versus bishops. Pope versus bishops. Where who's going to win? And this is what drives me insane with these debates between East and West. The East is trying to emphasize the authority of the bishops, and when I say West, I mean like Catholic apologists. They're trying to emphasize the authority of the Pope. Look, they're both necessary. They both need each other. You can't have one without the other. That's how it works. Head and body always act together, whether it's ecumenical councils or whether it's papal infallibility. The Pope will always act with his brother bishops. He'll always act with his brother bishops. That's what the Vatican I fathers had in mind. And that's why they didn't define what he has to do beforehand. And we're going to get into that. And actually, let's go ahead and get into that. Let's unpack the Relatio. So I'm going to bring my Kindle reader here, and we're going to read the Relatio here. I want to make sure the video is still there. Where did it go? Here we go. Okay. Hopefully I'm not putting you guys to sleep. This, like I said, this is not for the faint of heart. This is not for the faint of heart. This is deep stuff. We're going to get into this. So Gasser has three things that he's going to unpack. About papal infallibility. So he's going to give the definition and unpack it. He's going to say that it has three things. The three keys are separate. Is papal infallibility separate? How is it separate from the church? Is it absolute? Is it meaning like does the Pope have absolute infallibility, meaning that anything he says is infallible, or and is it personal? Parker Elijah reads as a Relatio as a little bedtime story. Well, that since I couldn't do it for my wife, I figured I'd do it for you guys. And if it's late for wherever you are watching, this might put you to sleep. You can use Google's text-to-speech. I actually used Google's text-to-speech in a lot of the stuff that I quoted here from the books that I have and put them in the PowerPoint. And you guys will see, I don't know if it'll be in this show, but maybe in the future show, because we're going to unpack the Relatio here. So here we go. Let's get into it. In what sense can the infallibility of the Roman pontiff be said to be personal? So here we go. He's going to talk about that. It is said to be personal in order to exclude in this way a distinction between the Roman pontiff and the Roman church. Indeed, infallibility is said to be personal in order to thereby exclude a distinction between the see and the one who holds the see. Since this distinction did not acquire any patrons in this general congregations, I shall refrain from saying anything about it. Therefore, having rejected the distinction between the Roman church and the Roman pontiff, between the see and the possessor of the see, that is, between the universal series and the individual Roman pontiffs succeeding each other in the series, we defend the personal infallibility of the Roman pontiff inasmuch as this prerogative belongs by the promise of Christ to each and every legitimate successor of Peter in his chair. In other words, all he's saying here is, look, the infallibility of the Pope is only personal because it belongs to the Pope when he defines, when he decrees something ex cathedra. In that sense, it is personal. Okay. Now he's going to talk about, he's going to unpack that. He goes, having said this, the notion of papal infallibility is not yet sufficiently defined. The personal infallibility of the Pope must be more accurately defined in itself in the following way. It does not belong to the Roman pontiff as a private teacher, as he is a private teacher, since as such, he is equal with all other private teachers. And as Cajetan wisely noted, and equal does not have power over equal. Not such power as the Roman pontiff exercises over the Church Universal. In other words, when the Pope is a private teacher, he is equal with other bishops. He's equal with other theologians. He's a private teacher, like Pope Benedict can write a book as Cardinal Ratzinger. He's just a theologian at that point. So just because it's written by a pope doesn't give it any more authority, right? Kyle Marks says he's back, and there's a lot of stuff that you missed. So I would encourage you to, after this, go back and watch a lot of things that you may have missed. to put these things in context. So here you go. We have these highlights, but we're going to read the Relatio. We're not taking it out of context. He says, hence we do not speak about personal infallibility, although we do defend the infallibility of the person of the Roman pontiff, not as an individual person, but as the person of the Roman pontiff or a public person, that is, as head of the church in his relation to the church universal. Indeed, it should not be said that the pontiff is infallible simply because of the authority of the papacy, but rather inasmuch as he is certainly and undoubtedly subject to the direction of divine assistance. By the authority of the papacy, the pontiff is always the supreme judge in matters of faith and morals, and the father and teacher of all Christians. But the divine assistance promised to him by which he cannot err, he only enjoys as such when he really and actually exercises his duty as supreme judge and universal teacher of the church in disputes about the faith. In other words, the Pope is only infallible when he speaks as a public person, which here is defined as when he speaks ex cathedra, when he binds the whole church. As a private person, he's not binding the whole church. As a public person, he is. As a private person, he's giving homilies, he's giving interviews. As a public person, he is teaching authoritatively. That's the difference. Thus, the sentence, the Roman pontiff is infallible, should not be treated as false, since Christ promised that infallibility to the person of Peter and his successors, but it is incomplete, since the Pope is only infallible when, by a solemn judgment, he defines a matter of faith and morals for the church universal. We just talked about this. Now, he's going to talk about what it means for the Pope to be separate, personal, separate, and absolute. Now it's separate. He went through personal. And now we're going to go into separate. So he says, in what sense can the infallibility of the Pope be said to be separate? It is able to be called separate, or rather distinct, because it rests on a special promise of Christ and therefore on a special assistance of the Holy Spirit, which assistance is not one and the same with that which the whole body of the teaching church enjoys when united with its head. For since Peter and his successor are the center of ecclesiastical unity, whose task it is to preserve the church in a unity of faith and charity and to repair the church when disturbed, his condition and his relation to the church is completely special. And to this special and distinct condition corresponds a special and distinct privilege. Therefore, in this sense, there belongs to the Roman pontiff a separate infallibility. To sum it up, what he's saying is, because the Pope has this task of making sure the church is in unity and making sure everyone's playing nice with each other and there's disputes, that's when he decrees the papal infallibility, it's going to be infallible because God is behind it. It is in this sense that he is separate. It's only in this sense, meaning that the Bishop of Los Angeles cannot stand up and decree papal infallibility. The Bishop of Detroit cannot decree something infallible, right? The Pope of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, I should say, can do that. And he's the only one who can, and this is only in this sense that he's separate. Not in the sense that he's separated from the church. And he goes on, and he makes that point. He says, but in saying this, we do not separate the pontiff from his ordained union with the church. You see that? But Ubi Petrus wants us to separate the two and then go into history and prove that. Excuse me, that's not what we believe would happen. That's not we don't believe that that's actually a possibility. We don't need to prove that. Moving on, he says, for the Pope is only infallible when exercising his function as teacher of all Christians and therefore spreading the whole church. He judges and defines what must be believed or rejected by all. Now, here's the crux. He is no more able to be separated from the universal church than the foundation from the building it is destined to support. Indeed, we do not separate the Pope defining from the cooperation and consent of the church, at least in the sense that we do not exclude this cooperation and this consent of the church. But Ubi Petrus wants us to go into history and find an instance where the Pope excludes this cooperation, doesn't that the Pope can go into, this oracle and say, okay, well, here's the truth, and everyone's going to believe it. That's an absurd thing. Okay, that's an absurd thing, because it can never happen, as the Relatio is saying, that the Pope is ever going to be separated from the Church. He cannot. That's impossible. A divine providence will not allow that to happen. This is clear from the purpose over which this prerogative has been divinely granted. And here, in this next sentence, in the next paragraph, he's going to talk about, in general, how papal infallibility works, in general. The purpose of this prerogative is the preservation of truth in the Church. The special exercise of this prerogative occurs when there arises somewhere in the Church scandals against the faith, dissensions, and heresies, which the bishops of the individual churches or even gathered together in provincial, sorry, I had to cough. Provincial council are unable to repress, so that they are forced to appeal to the apostolic see. It's very tiring to keep talking for 2 hours when you have lack of sleep. Sorry. Appeal to the apostolic see regarding the case, or when the bishops themselves are infected by the sad stain of error. In other words, generally speaking, ordinarily speaking, the way papal infallibility comes into play is there are dissensions, there are heresies, and the bishops are disputing against each other. Okay? They're disputing against each other of what the Church has always taught. And he goes on, he says, and thereby we did not exclude the cooperation of the Church, because the infallibility of the Roman Pontiff does not come to him in the manner of inspiration or of revelation, but through a divine assistance. This is what we talked about earlier. This is what the Relatio was saying. We do not exclude the cooperation of the Church. Why not? Why don't you exclude it? If the Pope is infallible, why does he need to go and see what the mind of the Church is? Why does he need that? He's infallible. He can just fart. Hey, that's infallible. That's what it is. That's what you think it is, but that's not what it is, right? It doesn't come to him in a form of inspiration where it's like there's a question that arises in the Church, and all of a sudden, because there's a question, now the Pope he has the answer. He doesn't always have the answer. He doesn't always have the answer. And so when he doesn't have the answer, he has an obligation to go seek the answer. And where is the answer found? The answer is found in Scripture, in tradition, in the bishops, in history, in the fathers. He has to use all those means before he decrees. He has a moral obligation of looking at all those. Moral obligation, not a juridical one. Meaning that if he doesn't do that, it's possible that one day, I shouldn't say that it is possible. It's an absurd situation. But let's just, as an example, let's say one day there's a Pope who one day says, you know what, I'm going to decree something. I'm going to decree something. And I'm not going to ask Church what it believes about it before I do. If that ever happens, what he's about to decree, if it's actually orthodox, he will be able to decree it. Because if it is actually orthodox, then it would have the consent of the Church behind it. It would. It would never be in opposition. The Pope will never decree something in complete opposition of the Church, because he is decreeing the mind of the Church. He is decreeing what the mind of the Church is. So if it doesn't have the consent of the Church behind it, if it doesn't have the mind of the Church behind it, then it's false, because the Church as a whole is infallible. And he receives this infallibility as an extension from the Church, and then he decrees it as infallible. Okay, so yes, it is technically possible for the Pope not to poll the bishops and still be infallible. It is possible. But if he doesn't poll the bishops and he decrees something that is infallible, then it would be in agreement with the bishops, because it assumed to have the consent of the bishops behind it. Okay. And then he goes on, he says, and therefore we do not exclude the cooperation of the Church, because the infallibility of the Roman Pontiff, we already read this, does not come to him in the manner of inspiration or of revelation, but through divine assistance. And divine assistance is something where the Church helps the Pope come to an understanding of what the question is, and then come to an understanding of what the answer is. Not as a gift, but as it says, divine assistance. God will ensure that the Pope has the full information to decree, before he decrees, to understand does this have the consent of the church. It says, therefore, the Pope, by reason of his office and the gravity of the matter, is held to use the means suitable for properly discerning and aptly enunciating the truth. These means are councils or advice of the bishops, cardinals, theologians, etc. Indeed, the means are diverse according to diversity of situation, and we should piously believe that in the divine assistance promised to Peter and his successors by Christ, there is simultaneously contained a promise about the means which are necessary and suitable to make an infallible pontifical judgment. In other words, we believe that the Pope, through all these means that he mentioned, will be able to have his full information of what the consent of the church is, and then decree. He says, and then this is where what I'm about to read is what Ubi Petrus quotes, and you'll see that it's taken out of its proper context. And I don't expect Ubi Petrus to sit here and do what I'm doing and read this relatio to people to put it in context, but I also don't expect him to quote it out of context and not give the full picture. At least give the full picture of what Gasser's saying. I don't know if Ubi Petrus has read Gasser. Maybe he's just read a work by an Eastern Orthodox apologist or whatever, a polemical work, and he's seen some quotes from Gasser and he's taken it. I don't know. Maybe he's read the whole thing more times than I have. I don't know. But anyway, he says, finally, and this is where Ubi quotes, finally, we do not separate the Pope even minimally from the consent of the church, as long as that consent is not laid down as a condition that is either antecedent or consequent. And so what Ubi is getting out of this is that that the Pope does not have a condition, does not have this juridical obligation to seek the consent of the church. And he's right. But it doesn't give the full picture. It doesn't balance things out. The Pope does not have a juridical obligation to seek the consent of the church by polling the bishops. He does not have a juridical obligation. But you'll see why Gasser says that. It's not because of what you think. It's not because Gasser imagines the Pope one day to, the Pope one day is going to wake up one day and try to define something in opposition to the church. That's not what he has in mind, right? That's not what Gasser has in mind. And so continuing on, he says, we are not able to separate the Pope from the consent of the church because this consent is never able to be lacking to him. We read that already, right? Indeed, since we believe that the Pope is infallible through the divine assistance, by that very fact, we also believe that the assent of the church will not be lacking to his definitions, since it is not able to happen that the body of bishops be separated from its head, and since the Church Universal is not able to fail. You understand? It's impossible for us in the Catholic Church it's not something that we believe that the Pope is one day going to be separated from his brother bishops. It's impossible, because when he is decreeing something, he is decreeing the mind of those brother bishops. Not all of them. Because if it's not the mind of the brother bishops, that means the church doesn't currently hold to that in any sense, in any way, to whatever he's decreeing. And if that's the fact, that means the church has failed. It is now false. Because if the present preaching of the magisterium is not teaching that he's about to decree, then it's a false teaching. And so he'd be impeded from decreeing it. And so if he decrees it, then it will have the mind of the bishops behind it. Again, not all of them. And and the church doesn't define how many of them, 50%, 80%, doesn't matter. That's not the part that matters. Just like the truth in ecumenical council has nothing to do with the polling of the bishops. It has nothing to do with that, right? It's God that makes the council infallible, not the voting of the bishops. He goes on, he says, note well, it is asked in what sense, and now he's going to get into the absolute. The infallibility of the Roman Pontiff is absolute. I reply and openly admit in no sense is pontifical infallibility absolute, because absolute infallibility belongs to God alone, who is the first and essential truth and who is never able to deceive or be deceived. There you have it. These people out there who think that the infallibility of the Pope is absolute. Whatever he says, it's infallible. Gasser is saying it's not absolute. It's not absolute because what he says, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. It's not absolute because it's only infallible when he's decreeing ex cathedra. That's it. He's only infallible then. All other infallibility, as communicated for a specific purpose, has its limits and its conditions, under which it is considered to be present. The same is valid in reference to the infallibility of the Roman Pontiff. For this infallibility is bound by certain limits and conditions. What those conditions may be should be deduced not a priority, but from the very promise or manifestation of the will of Christ. Now, what follows from the promise of Christ made to Peter and his successors as far as these conditions are concerned. He promised Peter the gift of inerrancy in Peter's relation to the universal church. And it quotes Matthew 16 and then John 21. Peter, placed outside this relation to the universal church, does not enjoy in his successors this charism of truth, which comes from that certain promise of Christ. And we're going to now go into this part. Very important part here. Nevertheless, some of the most reverend fathers, not content with these conditions, go farther and even want to put into this constitution conditions which are found different ways in different theological treatises and which concern the good faith and diligence of the pontiff in searching out and enunciating truth. Listen to what he's saying. Listen to what he's saying. He's saying there are some, and he's talking about the minority bishops that we talked about earlier. He's saying some of these bishops in this council want us to include a condition for the Pope to seek the consent of the church before he decrees, just to be sure the consent of the church is behind it. And he says, however, these things, since they concern the conscience of the pontiff rather than his relation to the church, must be considered as touching on the moral order than the dogmatic order. In other words, what Vatican I is defining, it's defining as far as papal infallibility, one thing only. It is defining the Pope as a public person decreeing ex cathedra. Only in his decree, only in his declaration, only in his proclamation. That is what is being defined in his relationship as a public person to the church. Any other relationship that he has with the church in private matters, whether beforehand, before the decree, and private matters after the decree, has nothing to do with papal infallibility in Vatican I. They did not touch on that question. They say, we're not going to answer that question. We're not interested in that. That is the only sense that they won't put a juridical condition of him seeking out the consent of the church before he decrees, because it's only defining him as an infallible person decreeing publicly. That's it. And what he's saying here is privately, for him to go and seek the consent of the church, that falls under the private matters, the private mind of the Pope, not his public mind. And we're not answering that question today, is what they're saying. We're answering the question of public matter. But they're not denying that there is this sense of moral obligation for the Pope beforehand to seek the consent of the church. They're not denying that. They're just not putting it as a condition. And so that's why he says it concerns the good faith and diligence of the pontiff in searching out and enunciating the truth. It has to do with his private mind, his conscience. It doesn't have nothing to do with his private relationship with the church, so we're not going to answer that question. We're not going to put this obligation, this moral obligation that has to do with him doing it and not doing it, and it falls under sinful and not sinful. If he doesn't do it, it's pretty much sinful for the Pope not to seek the consent of the church before he decrees. It's sinful in his part. And I have theologians that teach this. If you want one, here's a book right here that teaches that. The Papacy and the Church. In the one of the last chapters, it literally talks about the Pope and having a moral obligation, looking at Bishop Gasser, what he's saying, that if he doesn't seek the consent of the church, it is sinful. And so the moral obligation is there, and it needs for the Pope is supposed to do that. That's how it's supposed to work. And listen very carefully, because Ubi Petrus has a lot of articles out there that blow my mind. I'm being very careful with how I'm trying to phrase this. I can't put it any other way. Okay, I'll just say it. He doesn't understand the church's teaching on papal infallibility, and so he asks for things that we would say shouldn't be there in the first place. I'll give you an example. Anytime where we have in the early church, the Pope has a stance on something, he'll come out like let's say the Synod of 649, right? Anytime the Pope has a stance on something, what he first does in the early church is he holds a synod of Roman bishops, because he wants to know, what is the mind of the church. And Ubi Petrus thinks that because he holds a synod of bishops beforehand, before he decides what he's going to do, that doesn't prove papal infallibility. That's what he thinks. And he wants us to go into history and find an instance where the Pope doesn't poll the bishops, doesn't have a synod, doesn't seek the consent of the church, and just speaks authoritatively, and everyone bows down. Where do we think, where does Gasser believe that? Where does Gasser believe that? It seems to me that Gasser is saying that the Pope has a moral obligation to seek the consent of the church, of asking the advice of the bishops. And if he doesn't do that, it falls under sinfulness. It's a moral obligation. And so he wants us to go back into history and find an instance in the church where the Pope committed sin, I guess. We don't believe that that's how papal infallibility works. I'm laying down the foundations. I will be proving, I promise you, I'll be proving all my interpretations of this from theologians, from popes themselves, and from bishops, not from Ubi Petrus's mind. Right? Understand that. He says, if it were otherwise, this gift of infallibility would not be an effective means for preserving and repairing the unity of the church. But in no way, therefore, should it be feared that the universal church could be led into error about faith through the bad faith and negligence of the pontiff. Meaning that, don't worry, the Pope will never lead the church into error. Why? He'll never lead the church into error if he doesn't study the matter, and he just tries to willy-nilly answer the question officially if he doesn't study the matter. Why? Why should we not worry? Because here's what he says. He says, for the protection of Christ and the divine assistance promised to the successors of Peter is a cause so efficacious that the judgment of the Supreme Pontiff would be impeded if it were to be erroneous and destructive of the church, or if in fact the Pontiff really arrives at a definition, it will truly stand infallibly. In other words, if he actually decrees it, it's going to have the stamp of approval from God behind it, and therefore it will have the mind of the church and the consent of the church behind it. Now there he says, he goes on, he goes, but some will persist and say, and again he's talking about the minority bishops, there remains therefore the duty of the pontiff, indeed most grave in its kind, of adhering to the means apt for discerning the truth. And although this matter is not strictly dogmatic, it is nevertheless intimately connected with dogma. For we define the dogmatic judgment of the Roman pontiff are infallible. Therefore, let us also define the form to be used by the pontiff in such a judgment. It seems, and so what he's building a case here, if in case you don't understand what he's saying here, he's saying that the minority bishops, some bishops here, want us to put into the definition this juridical obligation for the Pope to seek the advice of the bishops before he decrees. And if he doesn't seek the advice of the bishops, then we don't have to follow this decree. Then it's not infallible. As if like this decree, this juridical condition is a condition that makes the Pope's decree infallible. As if that's what makes it infallible. Okay? That's the case he's building, and now he's going to respond to those people. It's almost like he's responding to Eastern Orthodox today, right? And so here's what Gasser would tell the Eastern Orthodox. It seems to me that this was the mind of some of the most reverent fathers as they spoke from this podium. But most eminent and reverent fathers, this proposal simply cannot be accepted. Why? Why can't we accept this proposal of putting this juridical condition into the definition of papal infallibility? Why? Because, he says, we are not dealing with something new here. Already thousands and thousands of dogmatic judgments have gone forth from the apostolic see. Where is the law which prescribed the form to be observed in such judgments? As the popes have decreed thousands and thousands of times. And obviously it's an exaggeration. The popes have decreed thousands of times. Where was this juridical condition put into those decrees prior? This is nothing new. This is nothing new. He's going to unpack this. He says, perhaps someone will say, if we don't have a law, let us make one. But let us not do this lest we run up against that already condemned law that said that the council was above the Pope. Now, notice he doesn't say the Pope is above the council, because you can assume also another possibility that the Pope is equal with the council. And I think it's an absurd thing for anyone to say, is the Pope above an ecumenical council? Of course he's not. Not because the ecumenical council has anything over the Pope. It doesn't. It's because it's not an ecumenical council unless the Pope is behind it. So how would he be behind something that he is involved in? So if it's officially an ecumenical council, it means the Pope put a stamp of approval on it. And if his stamp of approval is on it, then he is on it himself. He cannot be above himself. Anyway, just a side note. Furthermore, of what use would be such a law? This is very important key. He says, would it not be completely useless, since it would never be able to be verified by the faithful and the bishops scattered throughout the world? Even more, it would be a very dangerous thing, since it would offer the opportunity for innumerable foolish objections and anxieties. Did you catch that? Did you catch that? What he's saying is, we are not going to put as a condition that the Pope has to go and pull the bishops. Let me go ask the bishops, what do they think? We're not going to put that as not that Gasser had in mind of the Pope ever doing anything without seeking the advice of the bishops. He didn't have that in mind. But he did not want to put that as a condition. And he gives the first answer. Reason number one, why? Reason number one is, let's say the Pope goes and pulls the bishops beforehand. Well, what's a good number for him to say, I have enough backing of bishops, now I'm going to decree it? 50%? For 51%? 80%? What's the good number? And so if that's a condition placed on the definition itself, imagine what happens if he decrees something and it has only like 50% of the bishops behind it, or it only has 80% of the bishops behind it. There's going to be people that say, well, what about the other 20%? They weren't behind it, so this is not infallible. It didn't have all the bishops. What's the condition? What's the number? He's saying because there's going to be all these anxieties and foolish objections after the fact, we can't put that in the definition. Not because it's false, not because we don't believe that he should do that, not because we don't believe he has an obligation to do that, but because if the bishops are split, what happens? What happens? Therefore, let Peter gird himself according to the word of our Lord Jesus Christ, since Peter does not grow old while the world grows old, but rather renews his powers like the eagle. But someone may still persist and say, but what about the human means, the aid of the church, the assent of the church, that the witness and advice of the bishops is not only not able to be excluded from the definition of infallibility, but should be put in the definition as being among the conditions which are a matter of faith. What we just talked about. He's laying that out again. Some say, well, why don't we just put that in the definition? And this is what he says. Therefore, this condition is said to be a matter of faith. And just how is that assertion proved? Is it contained in the promise of Christ? It seems to me that not only is that not contained in that promise, but rather that in that promise, the contrary is contained. Indeed, it cannot be denied that in the relation of Peter to the church, and I put my note here. Here, he is speaking of the public relation of Peter to the church, not private, meaning he is dealing with the actual definition of the dogma of papal infallibility, where the Pope speaks as cathedra. He is not dealing with the private relation of the Pope with the church. Indeed, it cannot be denied that in the relation of Peter to the church, to which Christ willed that the infallibility of Peter be joined, there is contained a special relation to Peter, of Peter to the apostles, and therefore also the bishops, since Christ said to Peter, I have prayed for you, and he quotes Luke 22-32. This, therefore, is the relation of the pontiff to the bishops that is contained in the promise of Christ. And then I highlight the next part. Why do I highlight the next part? Because it is in this part that Ubi Petrus strips out of context what Gasser is saying. The highlighted part is what Ubi Petrus quotes. He says, if these words of Christ are to have their necessary force, then it seems to me that one should conclude that the brothers, that is the bishops, in order that they be firm in the faith, need the aid and advice of Peter and his successors, and not vice versa. And what he's gathering out of that is that the Pope doesn't need the bishops need the Pope. Sure, again, there's truth to that in what Gasser is actually saying. But the context here is not because Gasser imagined that the Pope will ever one day, define something in opposition to the bishops. The context here is this. Remember, going back to the previous paragraphs where he's talking about what happens when there are disputes between the bishops among themselves. What happens when there are arguments, when the church is split in the present preaching of the church? The bishops don't agree with each other. There's two stances out there. 50% of the bishops say A and 50% say B. What happens? You don't have the full consent of the church behind your definition anymore. It's impossible because it's split. So what is the Pope supposed to do? Is he supposed to say, well, we're screwed. I don't have the answer. It's over. No. He's saying because Christ promised Peter specifically this. He promised Peter specifically that his faith will not fail him. He didn't promise this to all the bishops. He promises to Peter, to him, to strengthen the faith of his brethren. And we believe that the Pope is a successor of Peter. And so that gift gets, because it's a divine institution, that gift gets transferred over to the popes in succession to Peter. And so because the promise was given to him, it is in that sense that the Pope does not need the bishops. The bishops need the Pope, because that's the promise that Christ gave. That doesn't mean that the Pope will decree in opposition to the bishops. There's A and there's B, 50 and 50. The Pope is not going to create an option C, because then he'd be the only one who believes option C. And that's impossible. Like Gasser says, it's impossible for the head and the body to ever be severed. It's either option A or option B that he's going to be in agreement with. And so he's acting with those brother bishops that he's in agreement with. But he's the one that makes that decree, because the gift is given to him to be prevented from error. It's not given to Bishop Barron. It's not given to Bishop Vigneron. It's not given to Bishop Tobin. It's not given to the patriarchs. It's given specifically to the Pope, to when he decrees something, he is prevented from speaking error. That's it. And that's, in that sense, he doesn't need the consent of the bishops. It is in that sense that he doesn't need the help of the bishops, because the help comes from God of preventing him from speaking that error. And so he takes this completely out of context, as if to say, because the Pope doesn't need the bishops, that the Pope can act in opposition to the bishops. That's not what he's saying. He's saying when there's disputes, what is he supposed to do? He's supposed to decide which one's the truth, which side has the truth, and then he acts with that side. He goes on, he says, thus it happens that those who favor this opinion, do not call upon sacred scripture, but upon certain axioms that to them seem completely conclusive. By the way, are y'all sleeping? I know I'm putting y'all to sleep, but just go ahead and tell me that if anybody is still there and hearing me, because I hope I'm still out there. Hope y'all can hear me still. So he says, what are these axioms? First axiom, the members should be joined to the head and the head to the members. From this axiom, they deduce that it is necessary for the Pope, in defining dogmas of faith, to do nothing without the advice and consent of his brothers. Wow. So he's saying that because there's this axiom out there that says the head and the body should never be separated, that the head and the members will always be joined together, that the Pope should always seek the advice and consent of his brothers. Always, right? I appreciate that. Thanks for the confirmation you guys can hear me. Thomas has a question, which is a good one. Is it an acceptable view in Catholicism that popes defining things are just like you and me, except that God will infallibly strike them down when they're about to err? That's exactly what papal infallibility is. That's all it is. It's not that the Pope is going to be led into the truth of the question at hand. He has this obligation of seeing what the consent of the church is before he decrees it, because he needs to know what the church believes about this, what it's always believed. And yeah, that would be an accurate way of putting it. Because it's a negative gift, is a negative infallibility, meaning he's prevented from speaking error. He's not led into the truth. It doesn't mean that God doesn't help him, but that's not where papal infallibility gift resides. That's just divine providence, right? Moving on to the Relatio here. So he says, before I reply to this objection, the objection of the Pope has to seek the advice of and the consent of the Church before he acts, before he replies to this, it will be helpful to remember that in this opinion of the adversaries, pay very close attention to these words, because you have to be a very careful thinker to look at these words and look at his emphasis. He says, before I reply, here's what I want you to understand. He says, we are dealing with a strict and absolute necessity of episcopal advice and help in every dogmatic judgment of the Roman Pontiff. So much so that it must have its place in the very definition of our dogmatic constitution. It's very important. We are dealing with a strict and absolute necessity, so much so of seeking the advice of the bishops, that it, and here's the answer, that's the question here, that it must have its place in the very definition. He says, it is in this strict and absolute necessity that the whole difference between us consists. It is only in this strict and absolute necessity that the only difference between you minority bishops who think that the Pope should seek the advice of the bishops before they decree, is only in this that of putting that strictly in the definition. Not we don't disagree on this in the sense that we disagree that the Pope is supposed to do that. The only disagreement between us two here is that you want it to be in the definition and we don't want it to be in the definition. Why not? Why wouldn't you want it to be in the definition? It's because, the reason number one, we answered already, because what happens when there are disputes? Then what? The advice of the bishop is not going to do you any good if the church is split. So papal infallibility becomes useless. It would be useless for God to give the Pope this gift, and then he would still have to seek the advice of the bishops before he decrees to know what the mind of the church is if the church is split. Number two, they can't put this in the decree because its purpose of this is to refute Gallicanism. It's to refute Gallicanism, meaning that Gallicanism says the Pope cannot act without the bishop's consent. And it's rejecting that because it's absurd. That means that his infallibility is dependent on the bishops, not dependent on God. It's not a gift from God, it's a gift from the bishops. And so I'm going to read that again. We are dealing with a strict and absolute necessity of episcopal advice and help in every dogmatic judgment of the Roman Pontiff, so much so that it must have its place in the very definition of our dogmatic constitution. It is in this strict and absolute necessity that the whole difference between us consists. The difference does not consist in the opportunist or some relative necessity that must be completely left to the judgment of the Roman Pontiff as he determines according to the circumstances. As such, this type of necessity cannot have a place in the definition of dogmatic constitution. It cannot have a place. That's the only difference between us. You want it in there, we say no. That's it. He goes on and he talks about, that said, I return to the axiom about head and members and make my response. A figure of speech is not an argument, or as is commonly said, every analogy limps. And that this comparison applied in this way really limps can be shown by the following reason. Are not the laity, among whom there are very many who are outstanding in knowledge and piety, and even more, are not the priests who exercise the duty of teaching their parishioners, are not they all members of the church? Who would doubt it? Therefore, should these also help the Pope by their advice and aid when he makes a dogmatic judgment? By no means. And why not? Is it not because they do not belong to the church teaching? All right. But at the same time, it is evident that the analogy about the headed members limps. But now it is asked whether the bishops also, although they are constituted by God as witness teachers and judges of the Christian faith, do not relate to the Pope as disciples to teacher when he's defining for the whole church and exercising his duty as universal teacher. Such is the case, for this is what the word of Christ and the words supreme judge, universal doctor, and pastor of the whole flock of Christ signify. So on that point too, the adduced comparison limps, and the consequence about the necessity of the advice of the bishops falls. Again, the necessity he's speaking here is a juridical necessity. We can't put it in the definition itself. He's not talking about an actual relative necessity, a moral obligation. The Pope has to do that. The bishops understood that the Pope will do that. They never imagined that the Pope would ever define in opposition to the bishops. Vatican I fathers. Again, I'm speaking to Catholics, and so we believe that Christ will ensure that the head and the members will never sever. Just as the bishops are not able to do anything in determining dogmas without the Pope, so the Pope is not able to do anything without the bishops. Now let us look at this axiom from each side, and then I'm not gonna read this part because it's redundant. He basically is talking about what Ubi was quoting. He says, however, how was his infallibility to be communicated? This I did not understand. The true reason why the bishops even gather in a general council are not infallible in matters of faith and morals without the Pope is to be found in the fact that Christ promised infallibility to the whole church. That is to the apostles together with Peter. And so we're going to move on to this section here, and then we'll end it with a very powerful quote. A very powerful quote from the Swiss bishops that Pius IX, the Pope who was under this Vatican Council, put a stamp of approval, their interpretation of papal infallibility. And he says, I agree that is the official interpretation. He put it in the actual, he made it into a magisterial document. Elijah going over 2 hours. I'm scratching the surface here. I have 30 slides. I think I'm on slide 5. As you can imagine, there's so much here to unpack. And this is part 1. And so this is why it took me a long time to do this response when I decided to. It's a lot of work involved in this, right? It takes a lot of time. Anyway, so I'd like to read this and then read some quotes after, and then I'm going to end it. But the issue is pressed by saying, and this is the third axiom, the consent of the church is a rule of faith which even the Pope ought to follow, and therefore he should consult those who rule the churches before he makes the definition in order that he may be certain about the consent of the churches. And so the minority bishops, he's responding to them, say, well, there's a third axiom here. The church, the Pope should seek the consent of the church because it is a rule of faith for the Pope to do that. And so that, because the Pope needs to see what the consent of the church is before he decrees, because he's not inspired by God. He's only divinely assisted, right? He says the matter has come to its extreme point. The extreme point is putting it in the definition. And we must accurately distinguish between true and false, lest we suffer shipwreck in port. Now, notice what he says here. He says, it is true that the Pope, in his definitions, ex cathedra, has the same sources that the church has, scripture and tradition. He has the same sources that the church has, scripture and tradition. It is true. Listen very carefully. He says, it is true. It is your period. It is your birthday period of the office. It is true that the consent of the present preaching of the whole magisterium, notice he says present preaching, it is true that the consent of the present preaching of the whole magisterium of the church, united with its head, is a rule of faith, even for pontifical definitions. It's a rule of faith, even for papal decrees, ex cathedra's. The consent of the church is a rule of faith, meaning he can't decree something that does not have the consent of the church behind it. So he has an obligation to seek that consent before he decrees. And so this is what Ubi quotes, and he wants you to think this next part is supporting the fact that the Pope can act in opposition to his brother bishops. He says, but from all that, it can in no way be deduced that there is a strict and absolute necessity of seeking that consent from the rulers of the churches or from the bishops. Now, notice one thing. The word consent here does not mean permission. It means agreement. He does not need to go seek to see if the bishops agree with him on this. Because he could already know that. He might already know that they agree with him already. He doesn't need to go seek it. And there's an example. Pope John Paul II, before he decreed on women ordination, he did not poll the bishops. You say, wait a minute. Isn't that what he's supposed to do? Isn't it sinful for him not to poll the bishops? Isn't that what you've been talking about this whole time? Think about how stupid it would be for the Pope to go poll the bishops to ask the question, hey, should we ordain women priests? Excuse me, that's an obvious answer. You don't need to go seek the bishops for that. He already knows that. He already knows the mind of the church. He already knows the scriptures. He already knows his tradition. He already knows the fathers. He already knows that the history of the church has always ordained men. There's never been a time where the church has ever ordained a single female. So why would he need to go seek the consent of the church to see if it agrees with him? And so that's the only reason why it doesn't have to be in the definition, because he could sometimes know what that is. The mind of the church is. The mind of the bishops is. He says, there's a strict and absolute, but from all this, it can in no way be deduced that there is a strict and absolute necessity for seeking that consent from the rulers of the churches or from the bishops. Remember, consent here means agreement. Keep that in mind as I read the next part. I say this because this consent is very frequently able to be deduced from the clear and manifest testimonies of sacred scripture, from the consent of antiquity, that is, of the Holy Fathers, from the opinion of theologians, and from other private means. Listen very carefully to this last part. All of which suffice for full information about the fact of the church's what? Consent. Well, wait a minute. I thought he doesn't need the consent of the church. Isn't that what he's saying? No. He's saying he doesn't need the manifest consent of the bishops. He doesn't need to go poll them every time he needs to do something. That's the ordinary way of doing things. That's the way it's supposed to work. But sometimes he already knows the answer. Why waste their time? He already knows the answer to the question, so he doesn't need to do it. Like, there's never been a female priest before. So why would we even ask that question? It's ironic, isn't it? That's what we're talking about today with female deaconesses, but that's different than female priests. So what he's saying is he doesn't need to poll the manifest consent of the bishops, seek their consent, not because it's not important, because he can already know what they believe. How? Because he can already know it from the mind of the church, from looking at scripture, from antiquity, from the fathers, from the opinion of theologians, from other private means, all which would suffice for full information about the fact of the church's consent. That means the church's consent is necessary to be there behind papal decrees. He's not saying the church's consent is not necessary. He's saying the polling of bishops is not necessary. But we cannot include that this polling of bishops has to be in the definition, because now we're saying papal infallibility. We're saying papal infallibility is a gift directly from God that is given to the Pope in preventing him from speaking anything heretical. It doesn't come from the consent of the church. It doesn't come from the consent and polling of the bishops. And so we cannot include this into the definition because it is not part of papal infallibility. It is part of the private means of the Pope of having this moral obligation. We're going to stop the Relatio there. I do want to read a quote, which I'm gonna skip over a bunch of this because I'm gonna present all this in the next show. But I want to skip over to a quote here. Oops. Let me go back here. Okay, so I thought this was the current slide. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I want to read this. This comes from this book called The True and False Infallibility of the Popes, Controversial Reply to Dr. Schultz by Dr. Joseph Fessler, Secretary General of Vatican I. So Dr. Joseph Fessler was in attendance at Vatican I. He always asks, I'm reading these comments as I do this. This is the last quote I'm going to read as to prove that my understanding of this is the official understanding of the Catholic Church. So Dr. Fessler was a bishop who wrote this work after Vatican I, refuting this idea of what Ubi Petrus is basically presenting, right? Nothing new under the sun. And it's the Swiss bishops that said this quote here, and the Pope put his stamp of approval on it and made it a magisterial document. So let's read it. It's very important. And the Pope at the time was the one at Vatican I. In order to complete what Monsignor Fessler here says, we borrow a passage from the pastoral instruction of the Swiss bishops in June 1871, which has been approved by brief of Pius IX. The definition of the council, say the Swiss bishops, has not in any respect brought about separation between the head and the members of the teaching body in the church. After the council, as before, and notice this theme about after the council as before, because he's going to talk about how it's business as usual. The popes have always sought, held synods and councils and stuff before they acted. Because after the council, as before, just like it was before, it'll be the same afterwards. The popes will exercise their office as doctors and chief pastors of the church, without forgetting that the bishops are appointed with them by the Holy Spirit, and according to the constitution of the church, as successors of the apostles, in order that, in concert with the Pope, and in subordination to the successor of the Prince of the Apostles, they may govern the church of God, as the popes did before the council. As the popes did before the council, so now after it they continue to strengthen their brethren, the bishops, in the faith. So also, in the government of the church, never will they undertake anything which concerns the universal church without taking the counsel and advice of the bishops. This is Pope Pius approving this interpretation. Never will they undertake anything, the popes, concerning the church universal, the whole church, universal church, without taking the counsel and advice of the bishops, as they did before the council in the first millennium, the second millennium. So now also afterwards will the popes summon councils, ask the advice of the bishops, scattered over the world, use every means in their power to obtain full understanding respecting that deposit of faith which has been confided confided to the church. It will be according to this only, an only immutable rule of faith, that they will decide as if in court of supreme and last instance, and infallibly for the universal church, all questions which can possibly arise on matters of faith or moral. So here's the question that we are always asked, is that we asked in the beginning of the question of the beginning of the show, that the East always asked us, well, if you guys define this whole thing about papal infallibility, then why do we need ecumenical councils? Papal infallibility is the Pope seeking what the mind of the church is and then decreeing. It's almost like it is in a sense like an ecumenical council without having the council. He goes and asks the bishops, what do we believe, bishops, about this matter? Because I can't decree something we never believe. I can't do that. So what do we believe? Oh, that's what we believe? Well, we're going to decree that. And how does that work? You look at two instances, Immaculate Conception and the Assumption of Mary. Pope Pius IX is the one that decreed Immaculate Conception. What happened? Did he wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm so bored right now, man. I think I'm going to just go ahead and decree Immaculate Conception. No. It actually started with the church herself, the people, the lay people, petitioning the bishops, saying, hey, we can y'all tell your homeboy Pope Pius IX to decree the Immaculate Conception. Then the bishops took that and went to the Pope and petitioned of the congregation, the diocese around the world. They took their petition and said, hey, Mr. Pope Pius IX, homeboy, if it's okay, we want you to decree this. Papal infallibility, that Mary is immaculately conceived from the moment of her conception. Okay, you guys want me to do that? Okay, well, here's what I'm going to do first. Before I'm able to do that, I'm going to poll y'all bishops, and you tell me if this is what the mind of the church is. And he did that. He polled the bishops. Over 90% said, decree it. But what did the bishops first do? They went back to their people and they said, hey, homeboys, I keep saying homeboys, I think it's funny. Hey, homeboys, do you guys believe this teaching about Immaculate Conception? They say, yes, we do. They took it to their priests. The answer to the priest took it to the bishops took it back to the Pope and said the church universal says, yes, we believe it. So now the Pope has full information about the mind of the church. So he just held an ecumenical council without holding an ecumenical council. He polled the bishops. And then after that, he decreed it. He decreed what the mind of the church is. The same exact example happened in the Assumption, 1950, 54, I think, 1958, 1950. He did exact same thing. Petition, from the petition to the Pope to the bishop to the priest to the congregation, diocese back to the priest back to the bishops to the Pope, and then he decrees it. He needs to know what the mind of the church is. You can't just make it up. You can't just assume, unless it's something obvious like ordination of female priests. I mean, come on, we've never had a female priest before. He doesn't need to go poll the bishops about that. And to end this, I have a theologian here, Richard Gaylarted's, his book called By What Authority. He has a section, just a short section I'm going to read to end this. And then I might come back tonight and do part 2 of whatever, how many that it's going to take to complete these. So remember when Ubi Petrus quotes, not from the consent of the church. Oh, by the way, let me finish reading this first. I'm sorry. He says, nevertheless, add the Swiss bishops, even when the popes use all possible means to obtain profound knowledge of the question of the faith which is under consideration, as the duties of their office require, yet is it not this purely human knowledge, however complete it may be, but it is the assistance of the Holy Spirit, that is to say, it is the special grace of his state peculiar to himself, which gives the Pope the indubitable assurance of infallibility. and which guarantees to all the faithful, which in absolute certainty, that the definitions of faith of the supreme teaching authority of the Pope are exempt from error. In other words, even though he has this duty of office that he's required to seek the consent of the church on a moral level, right? That he'll never act, as he says, without looking at the bishops. Even though he has his duty, that's not the part that makes this definition of faith that he's decreeing infallible. It's not the bishop's consent. It is the promise of Christ to Peter. It is the assistance of the Holy Spirit that makes it infallible. It is God, his Holy Trinity, Holy God himself, that makes it infallible, because the Pope decreed it. That means it has no error behind it. And so now, one last thing, the consent of the church. The consent of the church does not need to be behind the Pope's definitions. Vatican I, right? Vatican I says that the infallibility of the Pope, the decree ex cathedra do not need the consent of the church. They're irreformable. They do not need the consent of the church. And Ubi Petrus thinks that means the Pope can act in opposition to the bishops. Well, let's look at this theologian, one of many, which I'll be looking into. He says, finally, the council taught that the solemn definitions of popes were irreformable of themselves and did not require the consent of the church. But what does this mean? This clause is often misunderstood and can give the impression that the Pope can act as a kind of church lone ranger apart from the other bishops. This was not the intent of Vatican I. For several centuries, a viewpoint has been lurking around in the church that held that when the Pope defines something, it cannot be considered binding until after the bishops had officially ratified the teaching, talking about Gallicanism. Vatican I rejected this position, not because they reviewed the Pope as someone who could or would act independent of other bishops, but because they assumed that a Pope would always be in a relationship with his other bishops, communicating with them and seeking their counsel. All the council was saying, in regards to the consent of the, not from the consent of the church, all the council was saying was that it was not necessary to impose a juridical ratification by the other bishops. It only has to do with not including it in the definition. It doesn't have anything to do with him actually must do that. He's required to do that. But if he doesn't do that, it doesn't mean the definition is now false. Okay? But he's required to seek the mind of the church. Is a moral obligation. He says, it is surely significant that before Pope Pius IX solemnly defined the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, and before Pope Pius XII solemnly defined the Assumption of Mary, both popes made a point of first writing to all the bishops and inquiring after the belief of the church on these matters, what we just talked about. And we're going to look into John Paul II, how he saw papal infallibility, what his interpretation was. Who are we going to believe? We're going to believe Pope Pius's stamp of approval on this interpretation? Are we going to believe Pope John Paul II? Or are we going to believe an Eastern Orthodox polemical apologist named Ubi Petrus to tell us what we believe? And then from that, try to disprove it by going into the history of the Tome of Leo, because the Tome of Leo was read at the Council of Chalcedon before it was accepted. Excuse me, that's how it's supposed to work. Papal infallibility is not the Pope acting in opposition to the bishops. It is the Pope working in unison with the bishops. Whether he does it at a council or he seeks their advice, he polls them and then seeks the mind and then defines. But there are times when the bishops are not in agreement with each other. So now we have 50-50 split, and the Pope has to choose which side is the right one. It can't be option C. Option C would be he being the Lone Ranger, being infallible, being the only one who's orthodox. That's impossible. That's an absurd position. So it's either going to be option A, option B. Is Christ God or is he not God? Is he have two natures or one nature? I'm sorry, Thomas is here. He's Oriental Orthodox. But just for the sake of the argument, the Pope is decreeing with the mind of at least a part of the bishops. Now, we'll get into we're going to get into that later when I do part 2 of unpacking the difference between positive sense and negative sense of infallibility. We'll get into that later and what that means. I'll take like a question or two if anybody has any questions. I can answer some, and I appreciate you guys' comments and you guys listening. I really appreciate your patience. I was going to go 2 hours. I went 2.5 almost. It's just so much information. I can probably go about 10 hours on this, and we'll see how long it takes to get through all this. So I'm just going to see if there are any questions, but I do appreciate your patience, your listening, interacting, your comments, any positive comments, any negative comment. I appreciate all of it. So it doesn't look like there are any questions. Going once, going twice. Just don't want to catch somebody in the middle of typing. Doesn't seem like I hope I answered a lot of the questions already. Any reading on Vatican I that you would recommend? Yes. My favorite that gives you a good idea of the thoughts and context behind the Vatican I fathers, and also going into Vatican II, is Herman J. Pottmeyer, Towards a Papacy and Communion. This book right here, I recommend this because he goes into the mind of the bishops at the time, what they believed on papal supremacy and papal infallibility, not just papal infallibility. Okay. So this one I would recommend also if you want something heavy, literally heavy, The Papacy and the Church. Dionne. Dionne is the author's name. Robert Dion or something. I don't know how to say that. The Papacy and the Church, a study of praxis and reception in ecumenical perspective. I like this book. This one doesn't have that much as far as what you're asking, but it's a fairly good book. By what authority? The Bishop of Rome by Tillard. We're going to be quoting a lot of that on the next show. Another one is Tillard, Church of Churches. Now, I don't necessarily agree with every single thing they say, but in their perspective of how the history played out, these are very, very valuable. And also in interpreting Vatican I in a more moderate sense, rather than in the Ubi Petrus. And not just Ubi Petrus, Catholics out there, right? A lot of Catholics believe what Ubi Petrus is saying is true because that's what they've been taught. Would the Pope be able to infallibly contradict Vatican II? Well, if Vatican II, it depends. If it decreed on something infallibly, then he cannot. He would be impeded, right? He has the divine. He has a divine right of decreeing anything he wants. But if it's false, he'll be impeded, right? Now he can decree something that is against Vatican II if it's something that is, on a less, I guess, in a ordinary magisterium level. And Michael Lofton would be, he's writing his dissertation on this, so he's the guy to go to on this. But I just briefly, he cannot, if there's a decree that Vatican II put out, which I don't recall any that they did put out, any official decree. But anything that is that is ordinary magisterium, he can decree something that Vatican II put out there. Like I don't know, like one day he can say, okay, we're going to get rid of the Novus Ordo. He can, right? He can do that. And that's not a dumb question at all. It's a very good question. So he can say, okay, we're going to get rid of this mass and let's do the new mass, right? So that is technically in contradiction to Vatican II taught. But Vatican II didn't teach that the Mass that they put forward is going to be like the Mass that everyone has to use, because the popes cannot bind, even the bishops cannot bind something like that. That's like, it's not something that comes from the deposit of faith. The Vatican II Mass doesn't come from the deposit of faith. The structure does, but the prayers and all that stuff, you can't ex cathedra that. It has to be something that comes from the deposit of faith, or things that are directly related to that deposit of faith. If Pope good, why donation of Constantine bad? Yes, I love that question. So the Ubi Petrus has a video out there on the forgeries of the papal quotes. And what's ironic is a lot of these popes that he's pointing the finger to are his own saints in the Eastern Orthodox Church, because they're from the first millennium. I wonder why they would want to make forgeries. Maybe because they actually believed in papal supremacy and infallibility, and they're your own saints. But that's a different topic, which I don't intend on ever getting into. I have no interest in that topic at all. If anybody else wants to take the task of answering that, they're more than welcome to. I think, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, what's his name? Lucatus is going to come on Reason and Theology to respond to Ubi Petrus on that, I think. But I also think he's going to be on William Albrecht's show responding to that. So he can take up that task. He's more than welcome to, obviously, but that's not for me to answer that task. So anyway, I want to thank everyone. Doesn't look like there is, and here's the Lucatus. Yes, I don't know if I said that right. Hold on one second. I meant to put this one. Okay, so now that you guys know, why I would not debate Ubi Petrus. I hope that makes sense now. I don't even agree with him about papal infallibility. How am I supposed to debate the topic? I don't even agree that the church teaches what he thinks it teaches. He wants me to go into history and find an instance where the Pope committed a sin by acting in opposition to the bishops, by acting as a lone ranger. He wants me to go into church history and find that for him. I don't believe that. Why would I even find that? Why would I need to find that? That's not what papal infallibility is. That's a misunderstanding of what it is. So I'm not interested in debating him. I would be tempted to if he revealed himself. If he wants to reveal himself, I think my door will open just a little bit. In any sense, God bless y'all. Yeah, I don't want to pay big bucks to debate him. God bless y'all. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I might be back if my voice allows me to, because I'm losing my voice. If God allows me to come back tonight and do part 2. If not tonight, I'll keep you posted. Have a wonderful weekend.